So today we're going to take a look at a three-pronged attack to synthesis, the Trident Mk I, released by Korg in 1980. Now, the Korg polyphonic synthesizer story begins with the polyphonic ensembles, then came the polyphonic synthesizers, which remain on my bucket list, and everybody else's in fact. Then came the Delta and Lambda, and then came the Trident, and shortly after the Trident came the Poly 6, which is a very well-known Korg polysynth. And the Trident has a fair bit in common with the Poly 6, but it also has quite a bit in common with older synthesizers as well. So it really straddles the 70s and 80s in terms of its sound and functionality. Now, it's got three main sections, hence Trident, so it would be logical to show you what those are. Let's start with Synthesizer. Now, when I first saw the Trident, I assumed it was like the ARP Quadra or the Roland RS-505 or the Krumar Multiman or any one of those synthesizers which is a top octave divide down paraphonic affair. But this is not actually. The synthesizer section is an 8-voice synthesizer section. For each of the voices, there are 2 VCOs. VCO2 has to share a waveform with VCO1, which is slightly annoying, but it can be tuned independently. There's then a resonant low-pass filter, which is an SSM 2044, the revered SSM chips. There is then an amp and one envelope generator, and that is for each voice. So whilst it is pretty basic, it is a fully articulated analog polysynth with SSM filters. So up next, the brass section. Let's listen to a couple of sounds. So this section derives its oscillators from the same oscillator board as the synthesizer section, and it's just sawtooth waves. You have dual octaves. There's then another SSM 2044, resonant low-pass filter, an envelope generator, and an amplifier, and it is singular. So all of those 8 oscillators go through one filter and one amp. So this is paraphonic, this section. There are some trigger options to help with the paraphonic articulation. There's then a trigger select, and that partly relates to this. Silence note 2468. What on earth is that? Well, what it means is how many notes do you have to play before the brass section is triggered? If it's on 2, you have to play 2 notes for the brass section to be triggered. If it's 4, you have to play 4 notes, etc. Let me show you. So why on earth would you want that kind of functionality? Well, Korg says in the manual that it's so you can control when the brass is coming in, so it might not be coming in all the time. You might be kind of tactical and work out what else you're playing on the keyboard and then set the brass select to the appropriate number, and then depending on what you're playing, you can bring the brass in and out. So it's a kind of performance function, and there is a logic to it, but it's very unusual. I think the only other synth I've ever seen that has something like that is another Korg. I think one of the PS series has some kind of control like that on one of the envelope generators. But yeah, very of the time and very unusual. So the third section is the string section. Let's have a quick listen first. So again, the oscillators are derived from the same oscillator board as the synthesizer section, and you've got 3 octaves that you can use simultaneously on this. And then you've got some basic controls. So there's an envelope generator, and actually each note has its own amp and its own envelope. So this section isn't paraphonic. There is some filtering and some EQ, but it's more of a kind of effect, like a master effect, rather than, per voice, and you can't control them from envelopes or anything like that. It's just manual control. Something you can do is turn off the ensemble and the vibrato. Then if you just take it down to one of the octaves, you can hear that it's just sawtooth waves. Have a listen. So it's very clever. They've basically used one synthesizer section and then through a bit of trickery got 3 different sections out of it at the same time. The last thing I need to show you is there's this function called bowing, which is supposed to emulate the amplitude articulation of a bow being drawn across strings. Let's give it a little listen. So it seems to kind of give a bump in the amplitude at the start of the sound. If you look at the waveform at the most extreme setting, you can see it compared to the non-bowing version. And it actually distorted a bit right at the top. I don't know if that's just because of the levels I was using or whether it always does that. But yeah, a strange feature, but I guess they were trying to make strings sound realistic. But nowadays we love these strings because they don't sound realistic. They sound like 70s strings. So a couple more things. There's a joystick in the bottom corner, very Korg, and an LFO hidden down there for vibrato and trills. There's also keyboard assigned so that you can put different sounds across different parts of the keyboard, left, right, or the whole keyboard. And then there's a flanger section, and you can run one of the sections through it at a time. So let's just give this a little listen. So completely over the top, totally unnecessary, but I'll take that all day. What a brilliant thing to have, just a self-oscillating, wild, screamy flanger that you can add to one of the sections. It adds more motion and more colour to the sound. So the entire point of the Trident is that you can use all of these sections at the same time. So let's give that a listen. So there were absolutely no effects on that, no processing, nothing. And it sounds like there's a huge reverb on it or something, but it's not. It's dry as a bone. That is what the Trident sounds like with all the sounds coming out at once. It's very, not in front of the neighbours, Cecil. It's quite a sound. And that's why the individual sounds are kind of quite basic, because if they were all very complicated, once you start stacking them together, it become a mess. But with these kind of clear and bright sounds, when you put them all together, it's just magnificent. Now, you might be thinking, yeah, that's all well and good, but after like 6 months, a year or something, would it not get a little bit tiresome because you're really limited to just the controls you've got on the panel here? And I say, yeah, fair enough, you are limited to what's on the panel there. Or are you? So in a scene reminiscent of Ace Ventura, Pet Detective, we're going to turn it around and have a look at the back. So there's a high and a low mix output, so you could run the low through some pedals and then run the high into the mixer and record them at the same time. There's then individual outputs, or separate outs as they call them, so you can process the different sections independently, which is a huge deal, but you can also pan them around and create those wonderful stereo images, which is what you've heard me doing just a moment ago. The synth and brass sections then have filter CV inputs. Ooh. So in the manual, Korg suggests that you can hook this up with things like the MS-01 or the SE300 or the MS-50 or the MS-20 or the KR-55. But unfortunately, you'd need to be some kind of absurd vintage dork to have all that specific equipment lying around in your studio for such an esoteric moment as this. There's also then a short trigger input for the envelope generator of the brass section, so we can start with a short trigger disco. We all love a good short trigger disco, don't we? Onto these sections here, you've got expression inputs for all three of the sections, and that's a VCA amplitude that you can modulate with the CV. And there's a total expression, which is all three sections at once, which is perfect with a voltage pedal, so you can swell things in and out. So let's take a sample and hold, send it to the filter input of one of these sections, then invert it and send it to the other filter, and then also send a sequenced CV to the string section, so that's kind of coming in and out, and listen to what that sounds like. So already it's starting to get a little bit more interesting. What about if we sequence a series of CVs to the three sections so that you cycle through them, synth, brass, string, synth, brass, string, synth, brass, strings, like that as we play. Let's have a listen. Already getting more interesting, and there's still absolutely tons of things we can try. I mean, let's just chuck a couple of things into the back of here and just see what comes out. So just a couple of basic experiments and we're already in completely different sonic territory thanks to these rear jacks. So there are way more sounds in the Trident than it first appears. Yes, you need external equipment to realise them, but they are in there. And this really does make a big difference in terms of the functionality of the Trident if you were going to use it in the studio for years and years. So I wanted to end by talking about the legacy of the Korg Trident. There isn't one. So it came out at a similar time as the Prophet 5 and the OBX and the Jupiter 8, and those synths were used by really famous artists on really famous recordings. And whilst some famous artists did use the Trident, there are no famous Trident songs or Trident riffs that everybody knows. It just does not have that kind of legacy. They didn't make it for long. It was very quickly superseded by affordable synths, digital synths, sample-based synths. And so it's one of the last kind of big analog polysynths / string synths that was made. They did, however, make a Mark II before they deleted the line, and whilst that was improved in a number of ways, particularly in the synthesizer section, they had a battery in them, like the Poly 6 and the Poly 61, that would inevitably leak after about 20 years, and it was positioned in such a way that it would leak all over the crucial circuit boards and components and cause merry mayhem. So if you see an affordable Poly 6 or 61 or Mark II Trident and you go, ooh, pick it up and phone up your tech and go, I got a great deal on a Mark II Trident, doesn't power up, I wondered if I could bring it round and you could get it going. They'll hang up on you because they know damn well what they're going to find when they open the inside. It's like the scene at the end of the Raiders of the Lost Ark with the melted faces. So be wary if you see a Mark II Trident, you need to know what's going on inside. If you like the sound of the Trident, I've made a big sample pack of lots of different sounds, which is available on the top tier on my Patreon. I've also put up there the music from this video and the stems of the music from this video. Huge thank you to my patrons for their support, and thank you to you for watching.